Welcome to Climate Islands, the first podcast by the United Nations Development Programme's Papua New Guinea Country Office. I am your host, Don Thomas. In this first edition, we look at the recent mission by the UNDP's Building Resilience to Climate Change team that conducted climate change and vulnerability assessments to remote islands and atolls in Morobe, East New Britain, Manus and Morobe Provinces, and the autonomous region of Bougainville. In this podcast, we will hear from John Poulsen, a climate change and disaster risk reduction expert, on his experience of the first leg of the mission into the Morobe Province. In November 2020, on board the chartered Sea Explorer, a team of climate change specialists from the United Nations Development Programme in Papua New Guinea, with colleagues from the Climate Change Development Authority and accompanied by the officers from the Morobe Provincial Administration, set sail for the islands of Aramot, Mandok, Malai, and Tami. The mission was part of the Building Resilience to Climate Change project and aimed to conduct a climate change vulnerability assessment for each of 4 remote island atolls. The project is financed by the Asian Development Bank. John and his team undertook this climate change journey, and here explains the first leg of a 3-month-long sea adventure, an adventure that would encompass 21 island and atoll sites. Their mission was to help assess and improve the future of communities and their Pacific Islands home. Welcome, John, to Climate Islands podcast. We are so happy you can share this journey. Can you explain to us about your Morobe mission?
Our mission in Morobe Province was to assess the impact of climate change on the coastlines and on the vulnerabilities of communities of the 4 islands and atolls. Many communities on most islands feel abandoned and forgotten by authorities and expressed some skepticism over future assistance. What is emerging from the mission is that climate change exacerbates already harsh conditions for island and atoll communities. Therefore, it may surprise many how basic life is for the islanders.
I understand water and sanitation are one of the most concerning impacts of climate change for the islanders.
On sanitation, there are few, if any, toilets. So often the islanders will use the sea for most sanitary purposes, including as toilet, and even births are sometimes done in the sea. Access to fresh water is consistently a big change. There's a real lack of clean drinking water, particularly so on the smaller islands. No electricity or power. In some places, medium-sized solar energy facilities had been installed for the communities, but often they lay rusting and not functioning for many years. Typically, because the technology was unsuited and sometimes too advanced for the local situation. The challenge, of course, is that significant improvement in the livelihoods usually requires access to power.
What is life like for the women?
Women's conditions are even harsher. For example, in some cases, whereas men have toilet facilities, women may not have access to toilets because the men simply would not permit that. The local communities of these 4 Morobe islands were very engaged and welcoming, which impressed me a lot. They're well aware of and live with the ever-increasing impacts of climate change. Thus, some communities have established climate change committees, although the capacity and access to information, as well as lack of resources, put serious constraints on the effectiveness of these committees.
Can you explain the other climate change impacts that you witnessed on this journey?
On our sea journey of Morobe, over 9 days, a consistent pattern of significant climate change impacts emerged. Impacts from rising sea levels include inundation, reduced access to fresh water, and flooding of land where people live and sustain themselves. Changes in seasonal patterns of wind, monsoons, and water currents result from increasing temperatures in air and seawater. This, in turn, affects livelihood conditions, including access to fish stocks and conditions for farming. The changes in seasonality are also becoming more unpredictable, which makes it even more difficult for communities to predict the conditions upon which their livelihoods depend. Quite clearly, climate change impacts, by exacerbating already challenging conditions, will in many cases be of existential importance. In fact, on some islands, elderly citizens encourage their younger family members to relocate because they don't see a long-term future on the islands.
How can communities adapt better to improve resilience to the impacts of climate change?
The causal relationship between island size, population density, and people's resilience to hazards is complex, but communities on the larger islands appear to be more resilient than those on smaller islands, in part because larger islands typically offer more varied resources, such as more diverse topography and forested land, and more opportunities to access fresh water. The future for people on the two smallest and most densely populated islands, Aromot and Mandok, seems particularly bleak. At the provincial consultations and training in Leh in early December 2020, the local agencies played a very active and constructive role. The Building Resilience to Climate Change project also serves to enhance the capacity of local authorities to assist local communities adapt to climate change and to improve the communication and collaboration between local authorities and the vulnerable local communities.
In the next edition of this series, we travel with John and the BRCC team on the next leg of their mission of the Building Resilience to Climate Change journey. Join us again for Climate Islands Podcast 2.